In this lecture on Dostoyevsky, and particularly his fictional character, the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov, we turn to some of the great, lasting, immortal ideas that characterize political theory as well as fiction, ideas of freedom and authority, of human nature and politics, of temptation and submission. What better individual to open these comments with than Jesus Christ? So we begin with these remarks from the New Testament. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, this is St. John 8, if ye continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They answered him, we be Abraham's seed, and were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be made free? Jesus then answered them, verily, verily, I say unto you, whatsoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. And the servant abideth not in the house forever, but the Son abideth forever. If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. Well, there's one other passage. This one from St. Matthew, chapter 4. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterwards a-hungered. And when the tempter came to him, he said, if thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. But Jesus answered and said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Then the devil take him up into the holy city, and setteth him on a pinnacle of the temple, and saith unto him, if thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. Jesus then said unto the devil, it is written again, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. Again, the devil taketh him up into an exceeding high mountain, and showeth him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, and saith unto him, all these things will I give thee, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. Then saith Jesus unto him, get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. Then the devil leaveth him, and behold, angels came and ministered unto him. Fyodor Dostoyevsky, the author of great novels, was not a political theorist, but he managed to express in his works extraordinary themes that continue to resonate in political and social theory and contemporary philosophy. We today will go to only one of his novels, The Brothers Karamazov, his last novel written in 1880, and to one of the chapters in The Brothers Karamazov, chapter 5, part 5, the chapter called The Grand Inquisitor. And we'll analyze this in the context of our main concern, which is perspectives on freedom. We'll look at the way in which Dostoyevsky, as a novelist then, manages with stunning precision to anticipate some of the main concerns of the 20th century about modern political movements, especially totalitarian movements. When we speak of Dostoyevsky, though, let us remember this. He is a novelist. He often constructs characters that are not speaking obviously for him, and in the case of the Grand Inquisitor that we'll be looking at in a moment, he deliberately constructs a composite figure, an incarnation of evil that represents satanic forces not only from the Roman Catholic Church, but also from Western science and technology, forces that Dostoevsky, as a Russian chauvinist, is against. He manages to create this composite figure of ultimate evil and to transmit through this figure words that, ironically enough, have lived much longer than any words that Dostoyevsky wrote about his own political philosophy. The story, the fable, as you may know from reading the Brothers Karamazov or from reading this one chapter, which is sometimes often assigned to political theory classes, apart from the novel because it stands on its own for its brilliance, for its eloquence. The chapter begins with a fable told by one of the great figures in this novel, Ivan, to his brother Alyosha. And the fable recounts the second coming of Christ. Christ comes again during an awkward period for the Roman Catholic Church, the 16th century, the Spanish Inquisition. And he comes to the town square of Seville. As he comes to the town square of Seville, the Grand Inquisitor, patterned on the historical figure at the time, the real Grand Inquisitor, Torquemada, is burning individuals at the stake. You know the story of the Spanish Inquisition. That is, thousands, literally thousands of people are burned at the stake, mainly Jews and Muslims, sometimes to confiscate their property, sometimes just to set an example of purity of faith. Christ comes at this time as these individuals are being persecuted, burned. And as he walks through the city, the novel records in a moving way how he manages to convey without a sound to people his identity. He conveys it through his radiance, through his presence, but above all through his compassion. In the midst of this terrible time when there is so much brutality, Christ's figure, in contrast, radiates empathy, a profound pity for humankind as is experiencing this tragedy. And as he does that, people recognize him, and they're drawn to him, and they crowd around him, and they beg him for some word, some counsel. The Grand Inquisitor, who is represented as an old cardinal, 90 years old, a figure that stands in the door of the church and watches all that's going on, immediately sees Christ, knows instantly that he has returned, and is satanic enough to set his soldiers on Christ. And the first important moment in the chapter is when the people, knowing it's Christ, are cowed into submission and accept the Grand Inquisitor's word. The action of the troops. He holds out his finger and bids the guards take him. And such is his power, the Grand Inquisitor's power. So completely are the people cowed into submission and trembling obedience to him that the crowd immediately makes way for the guards. And in the midst of the tomb-like silence that has suddenly fallen, they lay hands on Christ and lead him away. The crowd instantly as one man bows down to the earth before the old Inquisitor. He blesses the people in silence and passes on, and Christ is taken away to a gloomy, vaulted dungeon in the ancient palace of the Holy Inquisition and shut away. In the pitch darkness, the iron door of the dungeon, though, is eventually opened, and the Grand Inquisitor himself comes in with a light in his hand. And the entire chapter is devoted to, a monologue, that is, the Grand Inquisitor speaking to the silent Christ, justifying his actions, justifying the way in which he has managed to subdue the people, to dominate the city, to visit on this city the worst curse, the curse of the Inquisition. The Inquisitor has a hard job ahead, but he's up to it. He has then come to visit Christ and to speak to Christ. He begs that Christ speak back to him, but throughout the whole chapter, not a word is uttered by Christ. So it's an assault on Christ, a verbal assault on Christ by the Grand Inquisitor. And he begins on his favorite theme, the theme of freedom. The freedom of their faith was dearer to you than anything in those days, 1,500 years ago. Did you not often say to them then, I will make you free, the truth shall make you free? For 15 centuries we have been wrestling with your freedom, but now it is ended and it's over for good, because we have vanquished freedom and have done so to make men happy. So long as man remains free, he strives for nothing so incessantly as to find as quickly as possible someone to worship. Man is tormented by no greater anxiety than to find someone to whom he can hand over quickly that gift of freedom with which the unhappy creature is born. Did you forget that man prefers even death to freedom of choice? Nothing is more seductive for man than his freedom of conscience. But at the same time, nothing is a greater torture. Only too well does he value the meaning of submission. And until men know that and understand that, they will all be unhappy. They will huddle close to us in fear, as chicks to the hen. They will marvel at us and be awe-stricken before us, and proud at our being so powerful. Now, this is the most eloquent enunciation that we can find in literature, either fiction or nonfiction, of the theme that becomes so important in the 20th century, known as the escape from freedom or the escape from fear theme. And before we go to Eric Fromm's book, which was written inspired by this chapter, called Escape from Freedom, let's make certain we've got the meaning of this down, because it is so important, not only for political theory, but for political science, that is, for analyzing political movements in our time. The thrust of the argument, as the Grand Inquisitor has just said, is that Locke is wrong. Thoreau is wrong. Forget the appeals to liberty and freedom that we've heard today, because they're bogus, they're nonsense. People are defined, they're distinguished not because they want freedom of choice, because they are given above all to the satisfaction of ultimate desire. They must be free from the arbitrary will of another person. Rubbish. From the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, there is one aspect of human personality that distinguishes us, and that's not the desire for freedom, but as Hobbes said, the desire for security, and lots of it. That is, we yearn for not liberty. We yearn for safety, as the chicks coming to the hen. We are not defined, as Thoreau would have it, by our desire for choice. We're horrified at the prospect of choice. When freedom of choice is presented to us, it's one of the most agonizing situations imaginable. We want the abolition of choice, not the freedom of choice. And every act, as the Grand Inquisitor says, during the Spanish Inquisition and inquisitions of every sort since from the Spanish Inquisition through Auschwitz, every act of individuals, when they are cowed by the authority of a politician or a figure of the church or of the state, every act of the masses suggests this, that people yearn to surrender their free will. They desire ultimately to give themselves to a higher source. And from this point of view, the Grand Inquisitor carries his argument. Why? Why should this be the case? Because there is joy in submission. Because the pattern of behavior that feminists like to discuss and argue, I'm thinking of Jean Miller's splendid book on feminism, psychology of women, the domination-submission syndrome, in which so many individuals find themselves locked into a state of behavior, a personality syndrome, in which one party dominates and the other party submits, and both derive pleasure from that. That situation, from the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, is the reality of human nature. It's not part of the capitalist male patriarchy or the male dominance in the United States or elsewhere. That's got nothing to do with it. It's rooted in human nature that individuals should find joy in submission and other individuals should want to dominate. The Grand Inquisitor plays to that theme. And as he recounts then his perspective on freedom, is precisely this, that what you've heard today is 100% wrong. That is, Locke and Thoreau are out in left field, that there is a reality to human nature, and that reality is escape from freedom. Now, this book by Erich Fromm, which I understand is one book that has not yet been dealt with in the course, extraordinary because we've covered so many key works of political philosophy, but it's a book, if you haven't seen it, I commend it to you strongly. It was inspired by, Erich Fromm says, the Grand Inquisitor chapter. It was published in England first under the title Fear of Freedom, and now in the United States, later in the United States, under Escape from Freedom. It is one of the true great classics of the 20th century because it records the most appalling, the most horrendous event of the 20th century, barring none, and that is the rise of Nazism. The rise of Nazism, grouped with the Holocaust, represents, from Fromm's point of view, a peculiar aspect of the domination-submission syndrome. And it's recounted, according to Fromm, especially in Hitler's own words. And after having discussed the chapter that I've just read from and the very verses that I've cited in Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, after discussing that chapter, Erich Fromm turns to the example of Nazism and to Hitler himself and says that Hitler, of all people, was very much aware of the conditions which make for the longing for submission and escape from freedom that we see epitomized in Germany during the 1930s and 40s. He gives an excellent description in Mein Kampf of the situation of the individual attending a mass meeting. And to quote from now Mein Kampf, "The mass meeting is necessary," Hitler says, "if only for the reason that in it the individual who is becoming an adherent of a new movement feels lonely, feels alienated, isolated, and is easily seized with the fear of being left alone. He receives for the first time the pictures of a greater organic community, something that has a strengthening and encouraging effect on him. If he steps for the first time out of his workplace, out of the big enterprise, in which he feels inevitably very small, into the mass meeting, and is now surrounded by thousands and thousands of people with the same conviction, then he gains a sense of his own security in his submission. He derives a need that must be satisfied, and we know how to satisfy it." That is Fromm's Escape from Freedom, and we want to analyze it a moment before we return to the Grand Inquisitor because it is so significant in terms of what Dostoyevsky's character is forecasting. That is, if we look at the events of this century, we see phenomena that are inexplicable unless we explain them through the Grand Inquisitor's analysis of freedom. We've said that Locke's idea of freedom has turned on the world, but hundreds of millions of people in China, in the Soviet Union, in Europe, especially under Nazism, hundreds of millions of people in this century in a wholly unprecedented way, if we look at the scourge of mass political movements that has swept through this world in this century, movements that had no conceivable parallel in previous centuries, where hundreds of millions of people were galvanized under the word of an individual or the doctrine of a party. How do we explain that phenomenon? There are political scientists, I assure you, scurrying all over the world and getting grants and writing dissertations on this still, trying to explain why so many individuals allowed themselves to be sucked into this domination-submission syndrome, into a state in which they freely and gladly and with joy give their will to a leader, surrender their allegiance in the most unthinking way to a despot, to a tyrant, to a Hitler. From Dostoyevsky's point of view, that is, from the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, because remember the Grand Inquisitor is created by Dostoyevsky, and he doesn't share that view, but nevertheless, from the point of view of this evil cardinal, this is all totally explicable. It's explicable in terms of the anonymity of our age. It's explicable in terms of the way this term that Durkheim coins in the 1880s of anomie, the term that means an individual's sense of terrible isolation, of being left alone, what Fromm analyzes in Escape from Freedom as the hallmark of our age, The way in which an individual can feel so at first lonely in a crowd and then, as Hitler saw, be drawn into that crowd, into that nexus, and understand for the first time that his identity is with the masses. That kind of attitude, that is special to the 20th century, and the Grand Inquisitor forecasts it brilliantly. When we talk then about liberty, we talk about, as Marx would say, an ideological construct that's wandering up there in the superstructure. The structure of the society, the base of the society is the psychology of the society, and that is, I want to obey. Give me shelter. I must escape from this kind of agony that's been imposed on me, the agony of isolation, and I escape through the collective. The escape from freedom theme is so good, it's so rich, that we can apply it to political movements across the board, whether we're speaking about the Cultural Revolution in China from 1965 to 69 under Mao Zedong, which would be inexplicable without this, or speaking of the Stalinist purges during the late 30s and the millions of people, tens of millions of people that were slaughtered as a result of that individual managing to impose upon the masses this will to obey, this unthinkable will to obey. Unthinkable because these individuals during the purges obviously didn't commit these crimes. They were brought to a state of hysteria, struggling to confess them as quickly as possible because of the nature of that society at that time, the society that so closely parallels Nazi Germany. We try to explain the Gulag, we try to explain Auschwitz, and we can't because we don't use the Grand Inquisitor. That is, we don't use the irrational component in individuals, which insists not upon freedom of choice, but the drive to obey. Well, when we go to the rest of the poem is an explication of this theme. And it's explained in terms of extraordinary construct. The construct is around the three temptations of Christ. That is, the way in which the Grand Inquisitor responds to these three temptations, as opposed to the way in which Christ responded to the three temptations, and the Grand Inquisitor informing Christ that he blew it, that in the response to the three temptations, he simply made a response that fundamentally miscalculated the nature of human nature, and more than that, the nature of freedom itself. So he begins, the Grand Inquisitor, in this way. The wise dread spirit, notice Satan, the wise as well as dread spirit, the spirit of self-destruction talked with you in the wilderness. And we are told in the books that he tempted you. Is that so? And could anything truer be said than what he revealed to you in those three questions and what you rejected and what in the books is called the temptations? In those three questions, the whole subsequent history of mankind is, as it were, brought together into one whole and foretold. And in them are united all the unsolved historical contradictions of human nature throughout the world. Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Dostoyevsky singles out that passage that I read from St. Matthew a moment ago and claims that in these three temptations contained all of the wisdom of the world. And so the poem, I keep calling it a poem because Ivan calls it a poem, but sometimes we call it a fable or a chapter in a book. The fable or the poem is constructed around, as I said, these three temptations. We go question by question through the poem. Judge yourself. Who was right, you or he who questioned you then? Remember the first question. Its meaning, in other words, was this. You would go into the world and are going with empty hands with some promise of freedom, which men in their simplicity and their natural unruliness can't even understand, which they in fact fear and they dread, since nothing has ever been more insupportable for a man in a human society than freedom. Do you see those stones in this parched and barren wilderness? Turn them into bread, and mankind will run after you like a flock, grateful and obedient, though forever trembling lest you withdraw your hand and deny them your bread. But you would not deprive man of freedom, and you rejected the offer, thinking, what is that freedom worth if obedience is bought with bread? You replied that man lives not by bread alone. But do you know that for the sake of that earthly bread, the spirit of the earth will rise up against you and fight with you and overcome you, and all will follow him, crying, who can compare with this beast? He has given us fire from heaven. Do you know that centuries will pass and humanity will proclaim through the mouth of their wisdom and science that there is no crime and therefore no sin, there is only hunger? Feed men and then demand virtue from them. In the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, make us your slaves, but feed us. This we call the temptation of plenty, the temptation of the, putting it broadly, when I talk to Columbia and Barnard students about this, of the cash nexus. The temptation then that asks, is there anything in life more important than money? Is there anything more important than earthly bread? Surely not the bread of heaven that Christ is selling. From the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, Christ, in terms of the first temptation, is badly misled. He thinks that individuals care more for the bread of heaven than for earthly bread. He thinks that the rewards of materialism are unimportant. He thinks that the temptations that are offered to each one of us each day are somehow irrelevant. From the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, this is a basic fallacy, and the idea of living a life according to Christ's teaching, simplify, 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 and denying oneself of all the conveniences of life, that isn't what most of us want to do. That's unreal. That's inhuman. And so when the Grand Inquisitor asks the question, have people, since Christ set forth his message, shown a desire to sell out to mammon, and Christ is silent, and the Grand Inquisitor screams back and says, yeah, they do sell out to mammon. Every time. We know that because we know what human nature is all about. Human nature is about not freedom. Human nature is about a desire to acquire. As Tracy Chapman likes to say, mountains of things. We define ourselves in terms of mountains of things. Christ despised that concept, or at least he renounced that concept, and we grab onto it. From the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, make us your slaves, but feed us. Give me the cash. Now, the second temptation is a more difficult one, a less direct one, as the Grand Inquisitor presents it. The second temptation, remember, applies not to Christ turning the bread into stones, or the stones into bread, but rather the challenge on the part of Satan when he takes Christ up on the pinnacle of the temple to jump off and to demonstrate his immortality before all the world by flying around with the angels. From the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, that would have the virtue of erasing all doubt, once and for all, from anyone's minds about the truth of Christ, because it would demonstrate Christ's immortality, not as Christ chose to demonstrate it, ascending to heaven in the middle of the night, but rather jumping off the temple and showing that Christ could perform supernatural acts, showing everyone, or more than that, as the Grand Inquisitor says, climbing down from the cross. The lines go, when the wise and dread spirit set you on the pinnacle of the temple and said to you, if thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down, you refused. You would not cast yourself down. Why? You didn't descend from the cross when they shouted to you, mocking and reviling you, if thou be the Son of God, come down from the cross. You did not descend, for again you would not enslave man by a miracle, by this ultimate miracle. Christ obviously had the power. Christ had the power when he came back, when those troops came at him from the Grand Inquisitor, to sweep those troops away. He's the power of a God. He has the power of a God. But he does not choose to use it. Why? Because he craves faith given freely and not based on a miracle. But here, too, you judged men too highly, for they are slaves, of course. They are weak and vile. And then in unforgettable lines, the Grand Inquisitor says, we have corrected your work and have founded it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. 3 words appropriately italicized by Dostoyevsky. I always think it's amazing that Dostoyevsky wrote this out without revision. Didn't change a word of it. He was under tremendous pressure to serialize the Brothers K. And each chapter came out without any revision. So as he writes miracle, mystery, and authority, he manages to encapsulate from his point of view precisely what the sin of arrogance is all about. From Dostoevsky's point of view, the sin of arrogance applies not only to the Roman Catholic Church, not only to the claim of infallibility on the part of the Pope of Rome, but it applies to Western culture generally, because as Western culture generally faces Russian culture, science and technology in the West, it tends to assume that they're playing the role of God, that they're infallible. A sin that Christ would not commit, a sin of pride, a sin of demonstrating one's infallibility. From Dostoevsky's point of view, from the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, this is what it's all about. Not just that we strive to know God, but that we play God. And we so often do this. We assert our infallibility. It was Bertrand Russell who said once that people know that it is impossible to become God, but there are a few men who will not admit that impossibility. And the impossibility of this is not admitted by some of the mass leaders of our time. From this point of view, then, it is a denial of freedom, because individuals, when they are deprived of free choice, cannot exercise their will. Christ wants us to accept him freely. He wants us to choose him of our own free will. He does not want to resolve the situation once and for all by climbing down from the cross and demonstrating his own immortality. Christ, according to Dostoevsky, the Grand Inquisitor, does not want, he never wanted to resort to miracle, mystery, and authority in order to cow individuals and make them submit. The Grand Inquisitor retorts that it was precisely Christ's mistake to do this because people love mystery. Remember what Goebbels said during the height of the Nazi horror, and that is, what do people want above all? They want a circus. They want entertainment, political entertainment. And the more mysterious that Nazism could be, the more unyielding in its domination, the more insistent in the way in which it performed one miracle of power after another, the more the chicks would come to the hen and accept their identity in submission. As Hobbes said, there is really no contest between freedom and authority. That is, every time people will go for authority because they just can't bear living in freedom, given the wolf-like state that most individuals are in. I alluded to the appalling situation which we've once again found ourselves in the Middle East. After reading the papers yesterday and today, we can only be sad at the recurrent nature of this tragedy. How long will individuals be caught in this kind of cycle of continuing violence? Of course, we will understand, won't we, if at some point individuals in the Middle East say, I can't take this any longer. We must have some security. We cannot continue to live a life of endless chaos. And that's what the Grand Inquisitor is appealing to, among other individuals. And that is that point in which individuals will say, we can't stand this any longer. We can't permit this degree of violence and dehumanization. Allow us to surrender to some higher authority that will pull us out of this mess. We know what it's like to be caught up in this kind of fear, but perhaps we don't know as well as people in Israel and the Arab countries. The problem is that we get caught up in this violence, in this insecurity, in this state of chaos, in this endless kind of self-destruction, not because we just make a mistake occasionally, not because the political policy of Israel or another country happens to be wrong. It's not that at all. It's because of human nature. We're like that. We need to accept that. And from the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, Christ's big mistake was to idealize human nature and think that we live according to the will of the Spirit or after the bread of heaven and all of that. We're after a rescue operation, people to pull us out, and a rescue operation, as Hobbes emphasized, in the most irrational manner possible. Miracle, mystery, and authority. Give us those, and we'll run as chicks to the hen. Now, the last of the three sins, remember there's, as we call them, the sin of plenty, the sin of pride, and now the sin of power, responds directly to this ingenious construction that Dostoyevsky has taken from Matthew. Who else would have conceived of this kind of response to the three temptations or imagined that anyone could come up with this? But remember what the last temptation is, and that is Satan takes Christ up into a high mountain and says, you name it and you got it. All the world is yours if you will give yourself, your soul, to me. That temptation of power, closely allied to the temptation of plenty, urges Christ to buy into the domination submission network and to dominate individuals wholly and completely, to once and for all impose on all the world peace. When the Grand Inquisitor targets it perfectly. You might have accepted then the sword of Caesar. Why did you reject that last gift that Satan offered you? Had you accepted that third counsel of the mighty Spirit, you would have accomplished all that man seeks on earth, and that is someone to worship, someone to keep his conscience. And then I love this line, and some means of uniting everyone in one indisputable, general, and unanimous anthill. That's what we want. We want to know what our duties are. We want to be able to have our functions perfectly designed, just as ants are in one massive anthill. Christ could have achieved that if he had only not resisted that last temptation. For the craving for universal unity, for total consensus, for a totalitarian community is the third and last anguish of men. Mankind as a whole has always striven to organize a universal state. Had you taken the world, had you taken Caesar's purple, you would have founded the universal state. You would have given us universal peace. But you did not. With us, then, we have the alternative. With us, everybody will be happy and will neither rebel nor everywhere destroy each other any more as they did under your freedom. Your freedom. It's a brilliant perspective on freedom. It's unbeatable. It seems to me to be so cogent and so powerful that it's no wonder that individuals keep returning to the Grand Inquisitor chapter. And people in my political theory course 10, 15 years later, as I've taught this at Barnard for 22 years, 15 years later will come back to me and said, I've forgotten everything about that course except this one thing, and that is, that Grand Inquisitor and the way in which he said the temptations of plenty, pride, and power. I can't forget that. Well, it is unforgettable because it's the ultimate answer, I think, to the first two perspectives of freedom that we've seen. And let's analyze now our three perspectives on freedom. The first perspective on freedom is Locke and Thoreau. And that is that to be free from the domination of another individual is not just something great, it is the defining characteristic of human nature. This is what we strive for above all else. Remember what Locke said in the second treatise. and that is that the state is constructed one purpose, and that is to ensure that no individual is subjected to the arbitrary absolute will of another man. That is the purpose of the state. John Stuart Mill says the same thing in the middle of the 19th century. And Thoreau takes up the cry with the essay on civil disobedience, saying that an individual's conscience and the free conscience of the person is the most sacred quality. And he elevates the idea of political and social freedom now to a sacrosanct position. This is what we want most of all, that we want freedom of conscience. What does the Grand Inquisitor say to that? That's the worst torment that anyone can have, to have that kind of freedom of conscience, to have so many choices in life. We want to be assigned a station. But that first freedom, the freedom of Locke and Thoreau, that freedom is the defining statement, with John Stuart Mill and any number of other liberals, that is the defining statement of political and social freedom. And in a nutshell, it's defined, remember, in these terms. None of us must sacrifice this quality, the quality to be free from the arbitrary absolute will of another. We fought the American Revolution over this. Now, the second kind of freedom is a very different kind of freedom. It's Christ's freedom. Remember what he says in St. John, "Accept me, and the truth shall set ye free." That version of freedom has echoed through the halls of political theory, and if you read the works of George Wilhelm Hegel and others, they apply this kind of freedom to the state and say this is the ultimate freedom, and that is that you are free insofar as you understand the truth of the state, the truth of God, but it's a spiritual freedom more than a political and a social freedom. It's a spiritual freedom that elevates you from what? From illusion, from the illusion of plenty. You are free insofar as you're emancipated from the cash nexus, from this drive that continually sucks us into getting more and more earthly bread rather than the bread of heaven. That kind of freedom, freedom from illusion, is what Plato was talking about when he said we're free in terms of freedom from the illusions in the wall of the cave and all of that. That kind of freedom is the freedom that comes only from truth. And Christ calls to us, each of us, to accept that kind of freedom. Now, the third kind of freedom is not freedom at all. It's a perspective on freedom, and that is escape from freedom. To escape from freedom is, from the Grand Inquisitor's point of view, not the defining element of human dignity and not spiritual questing. And it's what most of us want to do. We either want to dominate or obey. We want to get into a situation where we can be ourselves and not into a situation which is Christ-like, or in Walden or fighting George III or whatever. We want to be in a situation that will allow us to express ourselves as we honestly feel. We want to be free from the agony of continuing choice and know what we are to do in society. That third perspective on freedom is the perspective on freedom that explains Auschwitz. If we deny that view of freedom, we deny the horrors of the Holocaust. We deny what's going on in so much of this century. We can't overlook what happened in Nazis. We can't possibly say that the Gulag and what Stalin did is irrelevant to the mainstream of world history. Rather, it's the opposite. Now, Dostoyevsky redeems himself at the end of the poem with a conclusion. And it's a moving conclusion, but I'll allow you to determine how persuasive it is. When the Inquisitor stopped speaking, he waited some time for his prisoner to answer him. His silence weighed down upon him. He saw that the prisoner had listened intently and calmly all the time, looking gently in his face, and evidently not wishing to reply. Ironic that Christ is now referred to as the prisoner. The old man longed for Christ to say something, however bitter and terrible. But Christ suddenly approaches the old man in silence and softly kisses him on his bloodless, aged lips. That was Christ's whole answer. The old man shudders. Something trembles at the edge of his lips. He goes to the door, he opens it, and he says to Christ, "Go, come no more, come never again, ever, ever." And he lets him out into the dark squares of the town. And so the prisoner leaves. And Alyosha asks, and the old man, the cardinal, the kiss burns in his heart, but the old man adheres to his idea. It's a perfect ending, and we can only gasp, it seems to me, at the perfection of this novelist, his finest work, the finest chapter in that work. But is it persuasive? In the contest between the ferocious exclusivity of this age in which individuals insist that kisses don't count, and the kind of compassion that Christ showed and still demonstrates as a kind of model for all of us to follow, that contest between inclusivity and exclusivity, between Hitler and Gandhi, between one form of political movement and another form of political movement, between one political leader and another, that kind of contest is the contest of our time. From Dostoyevsky's point of view, it ends with a kiss.